it was requested that we talk about the apostles. And so we're going to spend a few weeks talking about the apostles. And we won't talk about them individually one by one, because after you get past the first tier, you get into a bunch that we just don't know a whole lot about. So we'll take them in little clumps. But this week we'll just generally talk about apostles and disciples, that sort of thing. And then, Lord willing, next week we'll talk about Peter and Andrew, and then James and John, and then we'll have to start clumping a little bit more once we get past the brothers. What would you say is the difference between a disciple and an apostle? The 12 are referred to both ways. Sometimes it'll say, and Jesus called his disciples to him, and what it means is he called the 12. And other times it says he called his disciples, and he picked out of those disciples 12, and then not every disciple was an apostle, but every apostle was a disciple.
The apostles could do things that the disciples couldn't.
Yeah. Jesus laid his hand on them.
Sometimes true, but not always. When he sends out the 72 on the limited commission, he gave them the ability to cast out demons. And so it's some of the things that the apostles did that most disciples couldn't do, but when those disciples were sent out on the limited commission, they had some special abilities. Technically, it's a little bit of semantics at times. A disciple is defined as somebody who is a follower, a learner, an imitator. So a disciple of John the Baptist is following John the Baptist. He's learning from John the Baptist. He's imitating John's lifestyle. Jesus comes along. John says he's the one you should follow. They become followers of Jesus, imitators of Jesus. That's the general idea of a disciple. When Jesus gives the Great Commission, he says, go into all the nations and make disciples. Right? So make people that follow me and imitate me and learn from me. But an apostle is one who is sent out with a commission. So you take a disciple, and then Jesus says, I'm going to send you to go do something. That becomes an apostle. The word in Greek is apostolos, and it means to send somebody out. You go with a job to do and the authority of the person that sent you to go do it. So disciples first, and then among the disciples were also apostles who were sent out for particular reasons. That last evening of Jesus' life, he's talking to his 12, trying to think if it was still 12 or if Judas had left by then. Anyway, what we would call the 12, that group. And he's saying, as my Father sent me, I'm sending you. And the same word is used. My Father sent me as an apostle, and now I'm sending you as apostles. So someone who's sent with a mission, who has a particular thing to accomplish and the authority to accomplish it. So look at Luke chapter 6. We'll look at the first two verses. We have kind of a general phrase here. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to pick some heads of grain, rub them in their hands, and eat the kernels. And some of the Pharisees asked, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? So we get the general term, disciples. But my mind immediately thinks the 12, right? Because they're walking with Jesus through a grain field. It's not one of those occasions where you've got lots and lots of people who are together and Jesus is teaching a big group. It's an occasion where they're traveling together, and some of the guys are getting heads of grain and rubbing them in their hands and getting a snack while they're going through the grain field. So it says disciple, but my mind thinks apostle. Right? Then look over at verse 12. A little more specific. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he designated as apostles. Right? So he calls the learners, and he designates 12 of them as those he would send out. So Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon who was called the Zealot, Judas son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Now, even in just that short rendering, you have guys with more than one name, and that's what David brought up last week. That's why we are where we are. There are several of the apostles who are listed under different names. And I downloaded a list. Let me tell you from whom I stole the information so you'll have that. The fellow's name is Dave Layton, and it's on Bible Talk TV. Bible Talk TV is a kind of a clearinghouse for Mike Mazzalongo's work. He was the dean of students at Oklahoma Christian back several years ago. Very good teacher, learned guy. And so Bible Talk TV is his webpage or website. And Dave has some stuff on it. And the list that he gave has them divided into groups of 4, and he gives 4 different times that they're listed. All 12 are listed in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts. John never gives a list of them. But we just read Luke's. Matthew has Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Philip and Bartholomew, who is also known as Nathaniel. Thomas and Matthew. James the son of Alphaeus. Lebbaeus, who may also be Thaddeus. Simon, and Judas Iscariot. So you've got more than one Simon in the list, any which way you want to look at it. You've got a couple of guys who have alternate names. Thomas is listed as Thomas all the way through, but Thomas has a nickname. Sometimes he's called Didymus, which means the twin. So we don't know whether we know who his twin is or not. Some scholars are convinced that they do, but we'll talk about that some more. And he's also known as Doubting Thomas, right? So we've got all kinds of different designations for these guys, and we'll talk about them a little bit more when we look at them individually. There's a couple of things going on that the author wanted us to think about. One of them is that Jesus prayed all night before he chose his apostles. And that's kind of telling. Jesus was known to pause for long periods of prayer before something big was going to happen. Right? He feeds the 5,000, sends his disciples on, stays up all night praying. Early the next morning he walks across the water, and it just kind of shifts gears in his ministry right about that time. He's going to let the people know a little bit more about who he is, and he's starting that march toward the cross. So he stays up all night and prays. In Luke chapter 6, he stays up all night and prays, and then he calls the disciples to himself, and he picks 12 of them. So when Jesus took you from being a disciple to being an apostle, it wasn't done haphazardly at all. Probably not just done by personality, but kind of by consensus, right? He's in conversation with his dad the night before, and then calls them together and makes the choices. So how much of an influence did his prayer life with the Father the night before have on which 12 were chosen the next day? So anyway, he thought that was important. It's worth mentioning. In Matthew 4, right before the Sermon on the Mount, you have Jesus being baptized. He goes out into the wilderness and is tempted by Satan for those 3 days. For 40 days. He comes back, and right before he presents what we call the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, and 7, he calls the disciples to him and picks out apostles. So big stuff is going on when he takes the time to kind of pray over it and then offer or appoint some of them to be apostles. Some of the apostles have a history that we know about before they start being with Jesus. We know that Andrew was a follower of John the Baptist. So when John introduces his group to Jesus, then Andrew says, well, Lord, where are you staying? And Jesus says, well, come with me and find out. Andrew spends the rest of the day with Jesus and then goes and finds his brother Peter and says, we found the Messiah. And so there was a background. Jesus meets them on the shoreline, and they've been fishing all night, and he says, well, throw your net on the other side. That's before the call. That's before he says, come and I'll make you fishers of men. So these guys knew Jesus a little bit prior. I don't know about Thomas. I don't know about Matthew. Right? Matthew's a tax collector. Jesus just shows up and says, leave that behind, come follow me. We don't have any prior knowledge about who Matthew is or why Jesus would have known him or why Matthew would have thought it was a good idea to quit doing what he was doing and follow Jesus. So some, we know them as disciples first and then as apostles, and some we only know them as apostles. Right? So next good question, out of all those multitudes, why 12? Why choose 12? Do what?
12 tribes.
12 tribes. That's most scholars. That's where they end up. You've got a multitude of people following Jesus, but he chooses 12, and 12 was kind of not a magic number, but an important number to the Israelites because of the 12 tribes. Now there are not a representative from each tribe. Most of them seem to have been from kind of up in the north where Jesus was from, up around the Galilee. You don't have a whole lot of folks from down south. It's more of an Israel occupation kind of group. And when they're called, they seem to be pretty cohesive, and we don't see infighting among the disciples or among the apostles. So culturally, they seem to have been somewhat connected. But on the other hand, they were very, very different people. And there were some backgrounds that could have, if they would have, caused some problems. But they didn't, which was a good thing. Look at Acts chapter 1. We're going to do one of those things where we make an absolute statement and then figure out why it's not absolute. But Acts 1, verse 20. Don't you love that? If certain verses just weren't there anymore, and you could just, bang your hand on the pulpit and say, that's the way it is. But then you have to go look at that other verse. So just about the time we think we've got God in a box, it's not that way. Now, here's what Peter has to say about there being 12. Peter said, it's written in the book of Psalms, may his place be deserted, let there be no one to dwell in it, and may another take his place of leadership. Who's he talking about? Judas, right? Judas has abdicated. He went against them. He's dead. And as a result, we need to get somebody else. Verse 21, the NIV has the word necessary. Therefore, it is necessary to choose one of the men who have been with us the whole time the Lord Jesus was living among us, beginning from John's baptism to the time when Jesus was taken up from us. For one of these must become a witness with us of his resurrection. So you've got it's necessary and we must. Right? So we've got 11, but we can't just have 11. We have to have 12.
Is there symbolism behind the number 12 to the Jewish people?
Other than just the fact that there were 12 tribes, I don't know of anything numerically that points to. When you think about the book of Revelation, the 12s are there. There's 24 elders that are in front of the throne, casting down their crowns in front of the throne and joining in with holy, holy, holy. You are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and praise because you have reigned and you have begun to reign. Those 24 typically, we think it's the old tribes, right? The tribes of Israel plus 12 apostles, right? So 24 elders would represent the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Old Covenant and Christ's covenant. Not absolute, but it fits. So again, I don't know why Peter thought that we had to have 12 other than Jesus originally chose 12. Now, if you're going to have a new one inserted every time an old one dies, we don't have the records to keep up with that. We also don't have anybody dying, or at least a record of anybody dying, soon enough for Paul to come in, and we definitely count him as an apostle. James dies at the hand of Herod, not too far from the time frame when Paul comes in, but if it's chronological, if Acts is dealing with chronological facts, verse, Paul is converted in chapter 9, and James dies in chapter 12. So there's other things going on in the meantime. Did James have to die for there to be 12? It doesn't seem that way. But for Peter, you know, Judas betrayed us. We need a new guy. And so they cast lots, and the lot falls on Matthias. So the Holy Spirit supplies the lack so that they can have 12 again. And if you count up how many people in the New Testament are referred to with that Greek word apostolos, how many people are sent out, I looked at one, you know, if you type in how many apostles were there, you've got that one guy who thinks he knows all the answers, and he just says there were 12. Well, definitely were more than 12. You've got 12 originals plus Matthias plus Paul. So we get to 14 in a hurry. The next one I read said somewhere between 25 and 30. That's the most believable one. The last one said 83. That there were 83 different people in the New Testament that had that word apostolos stuck in their description, that they were sent. But some of those were like Paul sent Timothy to Ephesus. Right? So he's not an apostle in the same sense that Paul was an apostle. He was just somebody that was sent. So, you know, the verb is there. He was sent, but not the office. So some people are doing the work of carrying a message, but they're not in the office of a...
They were sent, but they weren't sent with a commission.
They weren't commissioned by God with the Great Commission. They were, you know, working for somebody perhaps on behalf of that, but not specifically chosen by God. I'll give you an example. In the New Testament, the Greek word for elder, like we talk about leaders in the church as being elders, is presbyteros, one of the words. And presbyteros simply means old man. Right? So if you're an old man, you're a presbyteros, but you're not necessarily an elder. Same word. And there's different passages where you have to just kind of use the context to understand whether we're talking about every man who's reached a particular age or men who are serving in leadership in the church. But it's the same word describing both guys. So again, there's some people in the New Testament that are described as apostles, but they're not the 12. They're not sent out by God as apostles in the same sense that these guys were. Uh-huh.
You said that like Timothy was sent out.
Mm-hmm.
Did he have powers, the ability to cast out demons? I mean, is there any record of him ever performing a miracle?
Okay. Was Timothy ever recorded as doing miracles? No, but there is a passage where Paul says, don't neglect the gifts that were given to you by the laying on of hands of the presbytery.
Of the
presbytery. That's a good King James word meaning the elders.
Okay.
So the elders had laid hands on him and commissioned him to do something. Sometimes when we see in the New Testament somebody laying hands on somebody, that miraculous deeds are the response. But this is the elders laying hands on him, not like Paul or Peter. When Paul laid hands on you or Peter laid hands on you, you might expect speaking in tongues and prophesying. But Timothy doesn't have that attributed to him. Just the work that he was doing seems to have been the outcome. They laid hands on him to commission him to do the work of preaching and leading. But no, I haven't run across it anyway. So you have an extremely important group of men who are the forefathers of the modern church. Right? When Jesus tells Peter, "Upon this rock I'll build my church," right? What you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. What you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. There's that sense that first generation of apostles was going to be involved in setting the stage for Christianity for the rest of time. So when we look at the things that they did, we consider them to be formative, not just what they were doing in Jerusalem at that time or what they were doing in Antioch at that time, but at least certain parts of those things that the apostles were teaching and doing, we consider them to be things that we should still teach and do. Acts chapter 2, 42-ish. See how my fingers aren't working. There they go. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. So the Jerusalem church, as soon as it's formed, we don't have they devoted themselves to Christ's doctrine. Right? That's what they're getting, but they're not getting it as, well, how do you say it? Well, you understand. They're not getting it as Jesus is saying this to us. They're getting it as Jesus' apostles are saying this to us. So the emphasis is on the authority of the apostles. So what the apostles say is what goes. So the church in Jerusalem is growing and learning what Jesus wanted the apostles to tell them. So Jesus sends them with a mission. Their mission is to teach. They teach. And the people are getting the message from this authoritative apostolic group of people. And later on, Paul comes to Antioch. He starts that mission where he's working some among the Jews, some among the Gentiles, eventually mainly among the Gentiles. And the same thing is true. He didn't travel with Jesus. He was never a disciple. That's kind of interesting. I had thought about that too just now. All of the original apostles were disciples and then apostles. Paul was never a disciple. He was on his way to persecute people of the way. When he meets Jesus, within 3 days he's converted and begins preaching Jesus. He's never a disciple until after he's an apostle. So he kind of is the opposite. There were a bunch of disciples that became apostles, and you've got Paul, who was an apostle, who kind of became a disciple. So you just can't put them all in the same envelope. They all were different people doing, having different experiences with that call that they received. Some of them are similar. The first four, Peter, Andrew, James, John, even worked together. They had a business. They were fishermen, and they were in the same group. I think, although I'm not completely sure, I think that James and John's daddy owned the business and was probably fairly wealthy. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but I think he was the big boss, and that Peter and Andrew worked with James and John. So when you call those four, a third of the apostles have known each other for years and have worked together. You've also got two sets of brothers. It's possible that James, the son of Alphaeus, and Matthew, the son of Alphaeus, are brothers. So maybe as many as half of the apostles have a sibling in the group. So it's very cohesive. And some of them are very, very similar. Excuse me. But then you think about Matthew, the tax collector, who is working for the Romans. And Simon, also known as Simon Zelotes or Simon the Zealot, who was sworn as an enemy of Rome and would have been happy to assassinate or to applaud those that did assassinate people that were working for Rome. And those two guys were sleeping next to each other on the ground in the ministry years. So the gospel, the personality of Jesus, the miracles of Jesus must have been so cohesive that even some tremendous differences could be overcome for some of these guys to be in the same place doing the same thing. But again, some of them were already a group. They just came in together. And some of them were not a group, and they came in and had to learn to be a group with the rest of them. And we don't have any record of how people felt about the choices. When you're choosing up teams, and you've got, I don't know how many disciples were there. Let's say you had 70 disciples who were all in one place at one time, and he's picking who's going to be an apostle. If you're one of the 70 and your name's not being called, was there any jealousy? Was there any animosity for these guys that didn't get called towards the guys who did? Was there any animosity among those who got called? Right? I can remember playing like street football. There'd be 7 or 8 of us all standing there, and we'd be picking up teams, and you knew who you wanted on your team. And so if you weren't the captain, then you didn't get to make the choice. And if the captain of your team chose somebody you didn't really want to have on your team, you'd jaw at him. You'd tell, why in the world would you choose that guy? He's slow and he can't catch. And, I wonder if, Peter and Andrew looked at Thomas and went, I don't know. Matt, you called who? Matthew the tax collector? Are you serious? Why would you want a tax collector in your group? And so you feel kind of puffed up and happy about your own place in the group, and then he chooses somebody that you can't imagine why he would have chosen. There had to be some special behind-the-scenes work going on with Jesus that we don't have it. The authors don't go into great detail telling us if Jesus had to intervene and get these guys to work well together, or if, just the choosing itself was enough, or the Holy Spirit himself was enough, and they were just cohesive from day one and went on about the work. We'll see that some of these guys are more important to the ministry than others. Some of them get to be involved with things that the other guys don't get to be involved with. And as a result, what does Thomas think? What does Matthew think? What does Nathaniel think when Peter, James, and John come back from being out with Jesus for a day or two by themselves, and they say, well, what happened? How did it go? Can't tell you. It's a secret. So there's a difference even among the 12. But originally, these are the 12 that he chose. And Lord willing, we'll find out what we can find out. And we won't know a lot about some of them, but we'll find out what we can find out about these 12 guys. Any questions or thoughts? No? Okay. Tell you guys bye.